favorite teacher of mine that likes to say, what you look for, you will find. What you look for, you will find. If you want to find despair and hopelessness and chaos, it abounds. If you want to find hope and redemption, it abounds too, but it's hiding like a mustard seed in a field. And I'm just privileged to be able to work every day in a world where we get to see that kind of stuff happen all the time. But it challenges. It's challenging. We're in the third week of our Shephelah series. First week we talked about the need to, if we're going to impact culture, if we're going to bring order to chaos, we're going to have to get into the middle of the chaos. And how we view the world, what we believe is fundamentally true about the world, makes a big difference. And after this weekend, that's a challenge. I don't want to get all heavy on you, but I also don't want to ignore some of the obvious. I hate it when we come to church and act like it's, what do you really believe about the world? Because this weekend challenges that. What do you believe is fundamentally true? Because there's part of us that's very tempted this week to go into scarcity view. There's not enough. Close it up. What do we really believe is true about the world? Do we really believe that God and redemption wins? It's challenging. And so last week we talked about if we're going to get into the mess, we talked about the Nazarite vow. We talked about the need to be distinct and the need to be different. Because if we're going to get into the mess, we can't become just like the mess. We've got to have something to offer that changes the world, that impacts the world, something to offer that the world doesn't have. Something to offer that the world cannot give. And what are those things? What do those things look like? And so we talked about Samson, and we talked about being in the middle of Shephelah, this place between the coastal plains and the Judah mountains, and living in this tension and not becoming just like the world around us, but nor can we just go up and live up on the hillside and disengage either. And we sat in that tension last week. And so this week we want to talk about city gates. And we have a lot of ground to cover. So you guys ready? Okay, good. Somebody say no. It's probably more true. It's probably more true. Nevertheless, we're gonna go anyway. City gates. In the ancient world, as human civilization moved forward, whether you like to use the word evolved or not, it's up to you. But as human civilization moved forward, we began to have the need to protect the places where we lived. And so people went from living in villages to living in fortified cities. The idea of a fortified city is essentially the idea of having your village and having your city with a wall around it. You would have this wall and you would be able to keep the enemies out. But the problem is that you've still got to get in and out of the city. So you can't put a hole in your wall to get in and out of the city and then expect, so what do you do with that place? And so every city usually had one city gate, almost without exception. There's one city we found that was different and unique, but almost without exception, every ancient city had one city gate. The idea of the city gate was that it forced a bottleneck, so that if your city ever came under siege, you could have an enemy army of 60,000 soldiers outside your city, but only 6 of them at a time can get through your door. And so no matter how big it is, you would put a city gate. And just inside the door, the city gate had chambers. And it started off with 2 chambers, one on either side. And you put soldiers in those chambers, and as the enemy comes through the door, you defend the city. And as soldiers perish, you put more soldiers in the chambers, and you try to hold off the siege as long as you can at the city gates. And as this technology evolved, you had this 2-chambered gate become a 4-chambered gate, 2 on each side. And that became a 6-chambered gate in the days of Solomon, 3 on either side. They're getting trickier and trickier. They're like, we'll confuse them, just add more rooms. Eventually in Hezekiah's day, they have an 8-chambered gate. Guess how many? 4 on either side. But they also started to add a second floor to the city gates. And what happened was as this technology just kept evolving, so much so that you couldn't get through the city gates anymore to take a city, so people started building siege ramps, and we're familiar with siege ramp technology and all that kind of stuff. But you could not penetrate the city gate anymore. Here's a picture that shows you the idea of a city gate. And again, the idea is to force a bottleneck. If you're going to try to get in the city, you're going to have to get through this area. We have a cutaway that kind of shows you how the technology, if you will, work. The next picture here. And that kind of shows, you can see the 2 floors. They could drop rocks. They could have archers up above. They could pour oil, boiling oil on the people coming through was one of the things that they would do, whether it was tar, pitch, or olive oil, or different things. But it was one of the ways that they defended the city. You can see the chambers. Here's an actual picture. This next picture will show you the actual gates at Tel Gezer. One of the places we go to actually have the conversation we're going to have today is at Tel Gezer. You can tell this is a city that Solomon fortified. And you can see how many chambers? 6 makes it the exact right period of history. The Bible apparently knows what it's talking about, apparently. Have a Solomonic gate right there. And so this was the idea. However, throughout history, you only had your city on average would come under siege once every 80 to 90 years. On average. You might live in a place where the city saw more exposure than that. But typically, on average, once every 80 to 90 years. You might see your city come under siege once in your lifetime. Would be the average experience. So the question arises, we've built this huge technology and this huge gate that might get used once a lifetime. What do we do for the other 79 years? And when we excavated city gates, we used to think it was no big deal, like, it's the city gates, we understand how they function. But the more and more we excavated city gates, the more we kept finding things that didn't make any sense. And over and over and over again, it happened in Gezer, right here. It happened at Megiddo. It happened at Hatzor. Every time we would uncover city gates, they would find hundreds of jars, bowls, plates by the thousands, measuring utensils, cups. They could not figure out what in the world was going on in the city gates. And so eventually, as they continued to study, they determined that the city gates became the place where that's where city civil life happened. It's where your courthouse would be. It's where your city officials would be. It's where your politicians would be. Don't you wish it was that easy today? It's where you'd find everything you needed to find. It would be at the city gates, and that's where the action was at. In fact, today, the word for a city gate, for gate in Hebrew, is sha'ar. Say sha'ar. The Israeli stock exchange today is called the sha'ar, after the Center for Civil Life, okay? So if you want to say plural gates, you go sha'arim. Say sha'arim. Sha'ar, gate, sha'arim, gates. Okay, what they also determined was that the city gates is where their welfare system was taking place. If you had somebody that was visiting from another city or another nation or another country and you wanted to say, look at how awesome we are. Look at how powerful we are. And you had a whole bunch of poor everywhere, that didn't prove how powerful you were. All these visitors would be like, you have no social infrastructure. You can't even get your resources to the right places. And so at the city gates was where the welfare system took place. Now, inside the city is where all the prime real estate's at, because inside the city here, you're building the city for protection. So the most prime real estate is inside. So your wealthy live inside the city. Your middle class lives in the city walls. You're like, huh? It's called casemate housing. It's a particularly Israelite, and it's also Canaanite and Israelite dwelling structures. Basically, your wall is an apartment complex, your city wall. It's called casemate housing. We talk more about it on the Footnotes podcast. But they live in the city walls. The poor are then driven outside the city walls to fend for themselves. Now, they might live in the surrounding villages, known as daughters. Like this would have had surrounding villages, daughters of Gezer. Jesus, when he speaks, don't weep for me, daughters of Jerusalem. He's not talking to women. He's talking to the villages that lay outside of Jerusalem. He's coming into Jerusalem. He's telling, don't weep for me, surrounding towns and villages. So the poor might be driven there. One of the other places that they were driven was to the city dump. Every city sat up on a hill. You would end up with a city on a hill. Remember the tell from last week? We showed the graphic of the tell. The city sits up on top of that hill, and you need somewhere for your sewage and your trash to go. So off of that hill flows your sewage. You can actually see in this city gate here, that canal right in the center. That would have had pavers over the top of it, and that was their main sewage line. And then twice a day, they open up the city fountain, and it flushes the sewage down to the dump area, where they're also dumping their trash, and they light it on fire, and it just sits there and smolders. Sewage and trash, and it just smolders. And they called that, the poor would go there to try to find sustenance, to try to find ways that they could live. And they called that the place where the worm never dies and your thirst is never quenched. It was also called the place of the weeping and gnashing of teeth, because that's where the poor are in misery. The poor sit and they weep and and there's a Hebrew expression for gnashing of teeth. It's the ze'akah, it's the cry, it's the misery. So what the city gates end up representing is the place where the world of poverty meets the world of abundance. And the poor come to the city gates to get some of the abundance from the haves, and the haves share what they have and give it to the have-nots. And at the city gate, you're supposed to have this system of justice that tries to at least go about the work of beginning to put things where they ought to be. And we find this in the scriptures. God uses this idea really, there's 22 examples of what I'm going to show you. I'll only show you 4, but there's 22. So here's the first one from Proverbs 22. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the sha'ar, at the gate. Where do you find the poor? At the gate. Do not crush them in your gate. Do not afflict them just because they're in need. Amos has this to say, therefore, because you trample on the poor, and you exact taxes of grain from him, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, and how great are your sins. You who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, and turn aside the needy in the sha'ar, in the gate. God says, be very careful how you manage your city gates. Do not crush or afflict the poor when they come to your gates looking for help. Do not turn them away. Do not do things for a bribe. Take care of people in your gates. Deuteronomy 14 says this. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your, it doesn't say towns, it says sha'arim. Say sha'arim. To lay it up within your gates. You're supposed to bring your abundance and bring your tithe every 3 years, and you're supposed to lay it up within the gates so that you can distribute it to those in need. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the alien, the fatherless, the orphan, and the widow, the alien, the orphan, and the widow, who are within your sha'arim. Where do you find them? In your gates. They shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. Deuteronomy 15, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your sha'arim within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. So as we keep talking about this Christ in Culture series and how do we impact the world that we live in, I think a great place to start the conversation, just start it, would be if we want to start impacting our culture, we may want to examine the way in which we are city gates. Like if we want to change, if we want to bring order to chaos, if we want to bring shalom crashing into the disorder of our world, we might want to start by just saying, are we city gates? And do we manage and do we run our city gates appropriately? And now I'm back to week 1 again, and abundance and scarcity. Because God says, don't turn away people at your gates. Close it down. Close it down. Don't let any in. Be careful how we treat our city gates. God says, I will judge you as my followers by how you manage the gates. I want to move to a different story. You're going to think it's completely disconnected. Let's go to the story of David and Goliath. It'll be connected, I promise. We're familiar with the story of David and Goliath. Even those of us that didn't grow up in church, might even be our first time here this week, we probably know the story of this shepherd boy who fells the giant with his sling and a stone. We know about this king named Saul who sits up in his tent as Goliath, the giant, the descendant of Anak and the Nephilim. He comes out and he taunts Israel and their God at the very hour when the shofar is sounding, signaling that the sacrifice is being made. As you're trying to turn your attention to prayer, Goliath is taunting you and your God in the valley of Elah. For 40 days, Saul does nothing. And then this small little shepherd boy, probably somewhere around 8 years old, give or take, shows up. He's like, well, I'm not, willing to. He marches down the hillside with a sling, falls the giant. Now, what I want to look at, we're familiar with that story. What we're not as familiar with is the historical context that Samuel sets up for us. It tells us about the world that the David and Goliath story happens in. So let's go back a few chapters of 1 Samuel 13, and it's going to describe what's going on in the world at that day. Now Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal, and the rest of the people went up after Shaul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, and the people who were present with them stayed in Gibeah of Benjamin. About 600 people, because the Holy Spirit couldn't remember that day. It's like, I can't remember, it was like 600. It might be relatively significant. But the Philistine, more on the Footnotes podcast for that one. But the Philistine, don't you love my commercials? They're so great. But the Philistine encamped in Michmash, and raiders came out of the camp of the Philistine in 3 companies. One company turned towards Ophrah, which if you say it in Hebrew is Oprah. What do you do with that? But one company turned towards Ophrah to the land of Shual. Another company turned towards Beth Horon. Another company turned towards the border that looks down on the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now listen. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel. That's outrageous, by the way. For a plowshare and for the mattocks. And 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for the setting of the goads. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan. But Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them, and the garrison of the Philistine went out to the pass of Michmash. So in this world, the world is controlled by the Philistines because they control the world of metal. How do we, if you're familiar with history, how do we talk about the different eras of history? By the metal. It's the Bronze Age, or it's the Iron Age, or it's the Iron II Age. The stronger you could make the metal, the more you controlled the world. Because you make 2 things with metal. What do you make? Tools. And you make weapons. And if you can control the agricultural commerce in an agricentric world, and if you can control war, if my sword is twice as strong as your sword, the battle's not going to last very long. And here are the Philistines in control. There is no blacksmith in Israel. And so the Philistines, the Philistine, control, they're not going to let you make weapons. No, we're not going to make it. And then when you have tools that you need sharpened, because there's no blacksmith in Israel, none, you have to go down to the Philistine, and they oppress you with unbelievably hard charges just to sharpen your axe. My point would be this. Do you remember our series on worship 2 series ago? And at one point we talked about work. And I stood up here and I said, what you do with your life matters. What you do is holy, sacred work. This battle, this day in the Old Testament is ruled by the Philistines because there's no blacksmith in Israel. Now, none of us would sit there and go blacksmithing. Now, that's holy and sacred, holy work. That's priestly business. And yet, because there's no blacksmith, somebody is able to rule and oppress the world with what they have. What if God's people had led the world in blacksmithing? And instead of oppressing their neighbor with it, what if they would have been like, no, we've got the leading metal technology. You have to come to our city gates, and we're going to give it away. We'll charge you next to nothing. Because that's what our God is like. Can you imagine what you do matters? If you could be the best of the best of the best, not for you, but for everybody else. That you could be generous with the world. Some of you are, I'm getting ahead of myself. There was a person in first service that came up, a farmer, that also is an expert in soil and working with trying to figure out how to make farming and soil more sustainable as the soil gets worse and worse and worse. And it was just like, I love that because it gives new, holy, sacred meaning to what I do. Because I'm experimenting with all this stuff and I want to be on the front end of this conversation so that people and the world and creation can be better. That we could bring order to chaos. And I was like, yes. It's awesome. Now, however, there's another piece of this. Because if you were a Jew and you heard the story of 1 Samuel, you had this whole text memorized as you heard it. And of course, we've been working on that, right? Because we've been talking about that for years now. So a lot of us have been working on memorizing our Old Testament. Right? Nobody's making eye contact with me. All right, good. But they did. And when they heard that, they would have immediately thought of the end of the book of Judges. Let me show you. Judges 20. And the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah. Wait a minute. Gibeah of Benjamin, we've been here before. We're going to end up there later in the story with Saul. He's at the same spot. That's where Saul's from. Saul's a Benjamite who mustered 700 chosen men. 600, 700, interesting. Among all these were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. So Benjamin had a special forces, a special ops combat unit trained with a sling that could hit a hair with a stone. We have an extra biblical reference that talks about the same group of people that doesn't mention they were left-handed, but it talks about how they could split a straw at 100 yards. It's like Navy SEALs of stone slinging. Listen, when you get to the end of the David and Goliath story, and David marches down the hillside with his sling, every Jew listening is going, that shouldn't be David. Because Saul's got stone slinging in his blood. Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin, the region of Gibeah, where they raise stone slingers. And he's sitting up in his tent, doing nothing. So the next observation I would make would be this: even if you're not the best of the best, even if you don't lead the industry in your field, are you willing to use what you have? Here's this little shepherd boy whose response is, well, I'm not the best with a sling. I'm no Saul, but I'm willing to use what I have. And God is able to do what we all know as the story of David and Goliath, because David is willing to take what little he does have and use it to, we've talked about this before, Kadush Hashem, to hallow the name. David's willing to use what he does have. So what you do is holy, sacred work. And strive to be the best at what you do so that you can bring a little piece of shalom to the world's chaos. But even if you're not the best of the best of the best, You still can't sit in your tent on top of a hill and say, well, it's not going to do any good. Because how much can God use Saul's sling? 0, because he's not using it. How much can he use David's sling? A lot, because he's willing to put it to work. You know what I hate about the David and Goliath story, though, about this series? I wasn't even going to use it, and then I decided to use it because I wanted to. But you know what I hate about using it? Is it furthers this like battle imagery. Because we're in the middle, like we're doing a Christ in Culture series. And it furthers this idea that we're in a culture war. Like we're in a culture war because of the color of our coffee cup and stuff. Like, and what we can and can't say and what everybody else is saying and not saying and all and I'm in the middle of a cult. Listen, we're not in the middle of a culture war. We're not in the middle of a culture war. If we like to cry persecution, you're not persecuted. Some of you might be. Some of you might be. But we as a people are not persecuted. Come with me this summer. I'll sit you in an archaeological site where the soil beneath your feet has been soaked with the blood of people who are persecuted. Come with me this weekend to Paris. We're not persecuted. But even when we find ourselves in the middle of a conversation where we are persecuted, where it feels like we are in the middle of a culture war, Jesus had some things to say about that. Jesus preached his Sermon on the Mount to a culture that was oppressed far harder than anything we've been familiar with. A culture where people were, by the powers that be and the institutions, killed, slaughtered, executed, persecuted, abused. And Jesus had a sermon, and in this sermon, he talked about, to this world, he talked about loving your enemies. And he had the audacity to speak to that group of people about forgiveness. He starts the sermon off with these statements: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are peacemakers. Blessed are the pure in heart. And at the end of this list, at the end of the list, he says this: blessed are those who are persecuted. And then right after that, immediately following, he says this, Matthew 5. You are the salt of the earth. Blessed are you when you're persecuted. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Wait, what? A city on a hill? Why does he say that? Because a city on a hill is the hope for people in need. The city on a hill is what you look at when you need a little shalom for your chaos. Because at the city on a hill, you can go to the city gates and you can find, and Jesus says you are salt, Jesus says you are light, and Jesus says you are the hope of city gates. You're the hope of a world in darkness. And yes, I know of the megachurch pastor that said the church isn't the hope of the world, Jesus is, and that's a really fun cliche. Here's the problem with it: that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. Jesus said, you are the light of the world. Jesus said, you are the city on a hill. And if you search the Gospel of John, Jesus says, streams of living water will flow from within you. And I know that we like to make it about Jesus because then it's no longer about me. You. We are not in a culture war. We are called to be salt and light and the hope of city gates. Now, we need to move towards our time at the Lord's Supper. We're not done thinking yet this morning. But our servers are going to go back there and do that. And if you're visiting us this morning, we have an open table, so we want you to come and join us. Celebrate the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus at the table with us. When they pass out the bread and the juice, just hold on to it, and we're going to take it all together. As they do that, I just want to mull over some of those implications that we've already brought up in the sermon, but I just wanted to go back and kind of walk through them one at a time. If we want to begin the conversation about impacting our culture, we can start impacting our culture by being city gates. And I love what Paul Patterson said to us as we were preparing our sermon this week. He said it's really not a conversation of being city gates because we are city gates. The question is, what kind of city gates are we going to be? Because as God's people, we are city gates. And God said, I want you to examine, I want you to look at what kind of city gates, what happens in your city gates. And I think that has implications for our church, and I think that has implications for our families, and I think that has implications for our individual lives, and I think it has implications maybe even for bigger things. But we can start impacting our culture by being city gates. Second implication would be this. We need to lead culture in all fields so that we have something to be generous with. What you do matters. We need to be able to lead culture. We can either lead it or we can be subject to it. And this isn't a lead it so that we can control it. Listen, we controlled the world for 1,400 years. We didn't do a real swell job with it. That's not, because that really wasn't what Jesus was talking about. It's really not what he was inviting us to. He was inviting us to something totally different where we give our lives away, not control the lives of others. We need to lead culture in all fields. Because we can either lead it or we can be subject to it. What you do matters. And I don't know how this applies to all the levels of life. I know there are principles. I know that Jesus really, really believed in forgiveness. I know that Jesus really, really believed in generosity. I know that he really believed in loving your enemies. Like, he was really adamant about that. But I don't know exactly what that means for all. I don't work in the world of civil government. That's why we need you to do it and be the best at doing what you do so that you can bring the Jesus conversation to bear in that corner of the world. I don't know what it means. This is a hard sermon. I had a lot of hard conversations. I went and hid in the tech room after a while because I don't know what it means to be a soldier. I don't know. I've never done that. But I know that's why we need you there, following the teachings and the ways of Jesus, because I don't know, and perhaps you will. That's why what you do matters. And I don't know about the tension of city gates. I know the heart of God needs to shape each and every calling that we have on our lives. Third implication. At the same time, we must be willing to use what we have and trust God will do amazing things with it. Throw your stone. I remember my rabbi sitting me down in the valley of Elah where the story of David and Goliath happened. And his big teaching point that day was, you've got to throw your stone. You got to be willing to throw it. Whatever it is, throw it. Maybe you're not the best at it. Maybe you've got a broken sling, but get out there and be willing to put it to use. Throw your stone. So even when we don't lead culture, even when we're totally just feel inept and inadequate, take what you have and get in the game. Because God can't use you if you're sitting in the stands. But if you'll take your broken vessel and say, Coach, I'm in, he can do incredible things with that. Fourth implication. We are not called to a culture war. We are called to be salt. We are called to be light. And we are called to be the hope of city gates.